Welcome once again to this last session of the Congress. We will continue with the agenda scheduled for today with another panel. This time in the panel we will have three teams of architects who have been awarded with the Richard Driehaus Award, the contest that has been organized by INTBAU and the Ministry of Public Works. What used to be the Ministry of Public Works up till a few months, it's now Transport, Mobility and Urban Agenda. And the moderator will be David Rivera, professor of the University of Architecture, College of Architecture in the University Autónoma of Madrid, and the editor of the magazine on architecture that is with Maritimo. So thank you very much, Alejandro. I'm going to briefly introduce all the participants. We have here today Ramón, Andrada, González Parrado, and Alfonso Zavala, who were awarded with this prize for their proposal to reform and complete the Alcazaba of Guadix. We have Elena Jiménez Sánchez and Abelardo Linares del Castillo-Valero, who worked in the Church of Santa María de Alcira in Valencia. And finally, we have the team Mainel that is composed by Eva Niño Mendizábal, Eva San Román Vázquez, and Carmen Carval Pérez, who worked on the proposal that we will mention later on for the street Carabolinha in Santiago, in Galicia, Spain. And I would like to ask the people responsible for Guadix's proposal the following. It's a question that has a lot to do with the debate and the reflections that we, the jury of the awards, have, and the academics in general, about whether the terminology that we use should be old or modern, if the language that we choose should be old or modern. And since it is not about a proposal of rebuilding the heritage, but rather an intervention, I wanted to know to what extent have you tried to represent the personality of the environment, the historic characteristics of the monument, and also the fact that you are working in 2020. Okay, so yes, I have to say that it's just one language, the language of architecture, really, in the sense that each place, each environment is going to be different, but I understand that the approach is just the one. There is one unique approach, and if you're in that environment in Guadix, we were just next to the Alcazaba, in a historic area that had been completely abandoned for a very long time. Obviously, you have to use a language that is similar to what you find there to maintain the spirit of the place. When the intervention takes place somewhere else, then maybe your approach will be different. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, obviously, nowadays, you have to use new technologies to help you, and also new materials, but also traditional materials that can be applied differently, or that you can combine with other things so that you obtain better results, more efficient results, but maintaining the essence of traditional construction with regards to materials that are close by, that don't require much transformation, that don't have to be, that don't require recycling, that don't have plastics, and so on. So it is very much possible to do those two things. In order not to take much time, in the very specific case of Guadix, I agree with what Alfonso was saying, but in the case of Guadix, we had three different interventions, and each of these interventions shows a different situation. In the case of the Alcazaba, what we tried to do was provided with a staircase, an entrance staircase, and the language is in the second term. So it's the architecture and the construction that dominate the intervention. In the rehabilitation of the palace to transform into a hotel, then it's an exercise, a rehabilitation exercise. And as for the housing, it was recovering housing that did not exist. So our language was supported in the construction itself. So there needs to be a real relationship between what is being built and the way in which it is obtained. that would be the first ideas that I would like to share with you. Well, obviously, all of you can add your opinion if you wish to do so, if you find it relevant. And as for the Santa Maria de Algeciras project, I'm going to tell you this. I don't know if I should say it, but since I'm not very formal, I wanted to tell you that in the jury, we had a heated debate with regards to one of the elements of the project, which was actually the closing of the square that separates it from the water. It's an element that I believe is beautiful, this pergola, this pavilion. So I wanted to ask you about this. The model that you used to design this pergola, or the example or the influence that you had, did you get it from some idea, some personal preference, or was it just a logical solution that you considered was logical to the problem you were facing? Well, I would like to answer to that question because it is a very specific question about an element of the project. I have to say that this pergola, this pavilion, actually came from the paintings of Sorolla. Sorolla is a Valencian painter. He knew Alcira, and he has beautiful orange trees paintings where he shows the architecture in the area, and he showed these elements, these arcades that we find in Valencia that can be the link to this pergola, that are well adapted to the urban conditionings of this project, this proposal. And it actually helped us to recompose the volume of the wall of the enclosure without having to rebuild absolutely everything, because in the proposal, the main problem that we had was that since it was an area that could be flooded, a seafront was created at the beginning of the 20th century. So if we were to unite it with a boardwalk, then it would be too low a wall with this boardwalk. So this element was transparent, allowed us to somehow give a glimpse of the volume of the walls without having to rebuild them. And I also have to say that this proposal also came from what Alfonso was saying about this hybrid language, this language that takes on certain elements of the area, but also the architecture itself. And it is the conception of the traditional city, a dense city that had been completely lost, because in the 20th century, after different reforms and the Civil War, what we had was a complete destruction of the urban fabric. And we had lots of industrial areas. We had barracks from the civil guard. So we had a dense city. So we wanted to take elements from the area so that we could build this idea of architecture as a community, a city that we share all over Spain, but that from a theoretical point of view was maybe defended by Jane Jacobs in the book Life and Death of American Cities. So it's actually something that anyone can understand, even if they come from the US. I want to insist on this because I knew that there was something there. And this reference to Sorolla is actually very interesting. It's a reference to the Mediterranean world. And what this pergola reminded me of was Sinker's projects for Germany. He tried to create a Mediterranean world in Germany. And this reference I thought was very interesting. And it also gave me a certain degree of abstraction in your proposal. Well, and Greece as well. Shimka also did a proposal for the Parthenon as well, for the palace, for the Greek monarchy. So yes, there were always references, and he also did the scenography for operas and so on. Sometimes it was more theatrical, sometimes it was more practical. So yes, it is something a bit more practical. It is closer to the traditional Valencian architecture than Schenkel, but these are just elements that we have learned. And the good thing about traditional architecture is that it can drink from all kinds of sources. Some of them can be very far away, but in the end it's all close. So you're not just referring to what has been published in the magazines in the last 10 years. You can also bring to our current days elements that that are also from the past. The Schindler has a lot to do. Yes, that's what we have done all through history. Okay, now a question for Mainel, so that you can all answer this question, and it has to do with a characteristic of your project, which is very different to what we see in the other projects, which is the fact that in your project, I would say that there are less shapes than atmosphere. What you're doing is really creating an atmosphere, and I think it's very difficult. It's very ethereal, very difficult to create that. So I wanted to ask you about this element, and then I wanted to know if you had also talked about that, about the fact that you should maybe make your project more or less concrete so that it would match with the place. Well, from the very first moment we visited the place, we realized that this was an environment that was very, very much built with many pre-existing things such as nature and buildings. It's not like Alcira, for instance, which was an environment that was destroyed, we could say. So we had to really base our work on that pre-existence and that atmosphere that already existed, and we thought that we shouldn't lose that atmosphere. So the project needed to highlight the importance of that atmosphere that mustn't be lost, and it had to be linked with the atmosphere of the old town that was also consolidated and that exists in Compostela with these dwellings, historical dwellings that are so well preserved. I don't know if you want to say something else. Would you like to say something else? Yes, I'm sure you do. I don't know what she thinks, but I can only confirm what Eva has said. When we got to Caramonilla, we did not expect finding what we found. The pictures that we had seen kind of gave us an idea of the fact that it was a street with a clearly established typology, and we could find certain traces of what Santiago was, but we didn't expect finding that magical ambience that we found. It was almost magical. Yes, that's it. So from the first time when we were there on the street, that could not be lost. So we acted accordingly. I'm sorry. And as they were saying, we were really shocked by that magical atmosphere, and there were lots of conversations so that we could reach that right point. We have to preserve this or that so that this can keep on having that magic, that essence of the project. So under no circumstances can we lose this magic in the street, even if we restore it. If we do a general intervention in Santiago, we mustn't lose that magic. That's what we wanted to preserve. All of that, how can I explain that? All of that intervention had to be united, and Santiago needed to be just one piece. And right now the street is left aside, so we needed to unify these aspects. Yes, basically the proposal tried to discover what were those parameters, those points that were hidden by the street, the wall that already existed that invades the whole environment in the convent, the pre-existing material elements of the dwellings, and the vegetable gardens, and the current architecture, because we have the Museum of Contemporary Art at the beginning of the street and the dwellings of Bodelo at the end of the street, and that are integrated within this environment that you were mentioning. So the whole project has been about fine-tuning all the little elements, trying to see what the parameters would be so that we could rehabilitate this street. So it was more of a rehabilitation process than a proposition process. It was a recovery, yes. And since you have concluded with that observation, I will ask you, is it very difficult to live outside of the equation, your ego in general? Because you always want to do something that is striking, don't you? Well, I want to say this from the bottom of my heart. Ever since we began with the company, but ever since we got to meet each other, we have this union between the three of us, and we know that ego does not exist. There is no ego. What's basic is for the intervention to not be noticed, or to be noticed as little as possible, so that the result is good, but our intervention, our hand must not be seen. And we have had that as a value from the beginning. Ever since we studied the master's degree, we knew that that should not be felt, or as little as possible. And in cases such as this one, where it's a rehabilitation, a clear rehabilitation, because some other times it's a new construction proposal, it's different. But in this case, whatever we did, and we had lots of proposals, and this is project number 100, anything that we did, demolishing this, or we would be damaging this landscape, or we would be damaging the vegetable gardens. We were so surrounded by pre-existing elements that we couldn't really make ourselves seen, and it was very difficult. It was very difficult when you have to intervene so much in the whole environment. Okay, well, so in the end, it did bear its fruit. Yes, it did. Okay, another question for Ramón and Alfonso. It's maybe a larger question, but I'm going to try and land it. You know that in these sorts of projects, we usually have to go against the current in the world of architecture. I mean, there are different opinions, different examples, but in general, we go against the current, and it's very difficult to explain why we're doing certain things and why we think this way or that. And they actually make it difficult for us, even the regulations, the technical regulations, accessibility. For instance, in your project, there are lots of ramps which are beautiful. They're beautiful ramps that I actually they actually remind me of some interesting projects from the 20th and 19th century. And my question is, to what extent have you had to fight against all of those technical rules, social, human hurdles, or have you not seen any problems when developing your proposal? I think that our project, as we were saying at the beginning, actually comes to solve architectural problems, really. So all of these things that you're saying has been treated naturally, in a very natural way, as you would in any other architectural project. The main problem maybe that we might have faced at a certain point, as you're saying, or as we said previously, was that of calling it traditional architecture. Actually, I find it difficult to say traditional architecture. I like to say architecture, and depending on the moment or the situation, it will be good or bad architecture. But I think that it is too formalistic to talk about whether it is traditional architecture or not. Using formal elements, rationalistic architecture is already 100 years old. So it's a debate that I find thrilling, but we only wanted to solve certain architectural problems with a constructive system, with a constructive solution in a specific place. And when you see it like that, then there's no problem really to what we're proposing. Well, yes, I think that it's good what you were saying about egos. I think that in this sort of interventions, but in general in architecture, there are approaches and approaches, and there are approaches that are filled with ego, and others simply try to be consistent and honest, and leaving ego aside and leaving things as they are or have always been. Popular architecture has been there for many years, and we were saying that yesterday. Well, sometimes they talk about minor architecture or bothersome or modest architecture. Then we had the master of the modest with Mr. Gandano, the Thatcher master. I think there are lots of different architectures, and if you have to build a skyscraper, it's one thing, and if you want to build a thatch, then it's something completely different. So that depends on your interest. What is it you want to do? Do you want to do a skyscraper or a hut? So we need to be as honest as we can. You have to try and follow the patterns that you find, and we had to see what sort of balcony, what sort of spans, what sort of order or disorder was there, and we tried to maintain it. Well, the thatch, you will see that thatches are illegal. You cannot build them because the law will not allow you to build one. Yes, it's true. Actually, yes, that's true. I have built houses with straw, mud, and stone, and I've legalized them, so you can do it. It can be done, but it's true that you can find many people against it. It's not easy, and the responsibility that you're taking on is greater. But that's for you to decide what you want to do, and it's what I was saying previously. It depends on your interest. So if you're building with brick walls, then we will use brick walls. But those bricks will have to be better isolated because we have to fulfill certain energy requirements. So we will use, for instance, natural cork outside, and then we will whitewash it with lime so that we can have a breathable wall. So those are the actions. Those are the actions. That's how I see it. A question for Abelardo with regards to what's local. I wanted to ask if somehow you have tried to find out people who live in the place where you're going to be working thought about your project. Did you find out about what they thought about it, what they thought about what the square should look like, what everything should look like? Were they for your solutions or against them? Or what other resources or means have you used to try and understand the nature of the specific place you would be working in? Well, in our case, since there was a pre-existence that wasn't there, that was to be found in documents and the plans and historic pictures that we gathered, because there was a previous phase which was documenting the project. So people are very much linked to the idea of what their city was. Sometimes even after things disappear, people find pictures and they like what was there before more than the new thing. It's a feeling of loss. Even if you didn't get to know that, there is that feeling of loss. For instance, that happened in Germany. In Germany, they rebuilt monuments that had not existed before the Second World War. They rebuilt them years later, and this is something that is in the city's DNA and their character and what people think of their city in general, the collective imaginary. So I think that when we talk about styles and so on, there is also an important part which we don't realize, which is the fact that when building with traditional techniques, we set limits for ourselves, and that creates traditional shapes that, seen from a different point of view, might not seem traditional, but the way we look at them is also very important, because you are always going to include certain criteria that are a bit more abstract or another way of seeing it, and that can be seen in the images, the different points of view that you're choosing, that will make this project what it is. I mean, they will be of traditional architecture, but it will bring it to the present. And I think that that's important, the communication between shapes. For instance, in our case, we were not so interested with the hidden, the cultured architecture, and maybe we're more interested in the popular architecture, traditional popular architecture. So vernacular is more interesting to us than classical, because we see certain values that in the end are cyclic. They repeat themselves. I don't know if you've answered my question. I think I have. I mean, we have included all the historic pictures. So this project is something that happens in the long term. So in this project, there is a part which is archaeology. And now we're starting the phase that has to do with archaeological excavations. And then we have a phase with citizenship and, well, it depends on what the city council decides to do, but there will be participatory processes. So we only have a communication with the city council because the rest is through the media. But we have incorporated many things, many elements that belong to the city itself. So it's not so much doing something in Alcira's language, but rather to give them back certain elements, such as the walls, the enclosure that were within the history of Alcira, but we don't have a direct contact with the people, and even more so in the situation we find ourselves in right now. Well, it was actually a mean-spirited question, because very often, people don't react as we expect them to react with regards to their monuments and their heritage. And it's a very interesting question, because in the end, we work for people, for very specific people who live in a specific place. So that's a point that architects haven't really considered in the history of humankind, and in the 20th century even less so. So that's why I was asking that question that was offered a bit as a trap. And now, Maniela, I wanted to ask you to answer to this question, which has to do with what you would like to do as an association in the future. What sort of work? Is this something that was a one-off, or would you like to keep on working in projects such as this one? What is the trend you would like to follow in the future? Well, we clearly are oriented towards realization, construction. In that framework, interventions with traditional construction techniques, traditional building techniques in spaces that have already been built. It doesn't matter if it is a house in an environment that has no historical value. We would use the techniques from the place, if they're feasible, if they're viable, obviously. But the problem is that the administration, as well as the private clients, don't all understand that point of view. We only have had one client who asked us specifically to do it in Galicia as well, who wanted to rehabilitate their home with traditional techniques. They didn't want plastic, they didn't want concrete, and they understood this, but it's not the normal situation. It's not so much what we want, but what, as you were saying, what the society demands. And it's very difficult to make them understand, well, yes, you're going to spend more money in building your house with these traditional techniques that we are offering you, but in the long term, you're going to spend less. It's something that's very difficult for people to understand. But I don't know. I don't know if I've answered your question. I might not have answered your question. Yes, you have. Somehow you have. But, well, yes. Well, okay. I'll consider it. I'll consider it has been answered. But maybe you would like to add something else, because the rest of you seem to want to take the floor. No, yes, we just wanted to reinforce what has been said by Eva. Our interventions, and since we have started working together, we wanted to respect architecture. And it's true that, as Eva has just said, that there are clients who, it's not whether they're easy or difficult. Each client has his or her opinion, and you can't really fight against that. They have their home. It's a private property, and they ask you certain things, and you can see it in a certain way. You can make them think with all the explanations at your disposal that it'd be better for them to save energy, because we can actually, as the Thatcher was saying, they have fascinating techniques. It's a traditional architecture, but really they're saving energy. It's amazing. So we try to do this pedagogical process with them, telling them about the settlement. It doesn't matter where the client comes from. We try to explain to them what's better for them, what's best for them. But then it's their decision. You have to adapt yourself to the decision that they made with a series of ideas that you gave them. Yes, and this is just a small addition. We have a project for an administration for a historical bridge, and trucks go through that bridge. So it's a clear example of the difficulty of doing this profession as we want with traditional materials, and they're asking us to use concrete to fulfill the technical code. And it's the administration. And we have tried for that not to happen. We have tried to offer them lots of different alternatives. And it has not been possible. It was not possible, and we will not be doing it that way. Yes, well, we have adapted it, but if they want concrete, we can't avoid for that to happen, because over this aqueduct, trucks have to run. But instead of just using concrete, we're going to create a lighter concrete block. Well, I think that in this profession's practice, if we want to develop it, it's not so much what we want to do, but rather what the administration and the clients allow us to do. Although we might make an effort to try and educate the population in general in this field.
Para rematar, que ya...
Well, finally, since I see that you have very clear ideas and you've gone through debate and work conscientiously, I'm architecture historian. So I would like to ask you, do you have any hero book, someone who is a role model for you or who has served as inspiration? Well, there's quite a few. We have mentioned Jane Jacobs, Sinkel. There have not been a lot of name dropping because we're talking about something else, but maybe you can mention some names. Well, it depends on the site. We intervene in a contemporary manner, even though we use traditional techniques. The project approach is quite contemporary. So our reference is vernacular architecture, which is anonymous, and we also learn from master artisans on a daily basis. And sometimes our interventions on architectural historic architecture is quite contemporary, but I cannot really mention a name. Well, since this has been very peaceful and civilized, I always try to stir up the debate. So I would just wanted you to criticize someone. No, this is not going to happen because everyone has their own style. On the same street of our intervention, we have very interesting examples of other architects, such as Otello, which is nice, but is not what we do. Everyone is criticized, after all, no matter how brilliant they are. CITA, for instance, with the Museum of Contemporary Art, is made of carved stone, which is not local, has nothing to do with the environment, and it does not really fit in well with the environment. So we could criticize CITA, of course. In the case of Albaicín, for instance, Albarracín, sorry, not Albaicín, Albarracín, what they've done there in Albarracín is pretty impressive. And I think that is our role model, if you like. Well, it's true that when we took on the project, we felt surrounded all over the place by very important works that we also had very much in mind at all times, but we tried to work in harmony with everything that was around the site. It's just like the attempt was to bring together the architecture around the site. And of course, there were different styles, but we find them all of a very good quality. So we just wanted to intervene in a harmonious way, trying to adapt ourselves to what was already there in small architectural details. But it was difficult because the site was very restricted. But I think our reference is really the place. Well, that's a nice note to finish this discussion on. Well, thank you, all of you, for this very interesting discussion. David, thank you for moderating the debate. We have a few questions from the audience. We have a question from Robert Adam. Robert Adam says that in his experience working in traditional architecture, he has always felt some rejection by some of his colleagues, and he wants to know that for the younger generations, do you feel that there is a greater flexibility or open-mindedness among the younger generations of architects, or do you also feel that rejection from colleagues? Well, I think the three of us agree on what I'm about to say. Well, the thing is, I haven't gotten my degree yet. I am still in the school, and I must say that I have indeed felt some rejection towards intervention, architectural recovery, and the integration of traditional architecture in a respectful manner with the environment. And it can be very frustrating sometimes because some people think that there are rules to be followed about how to intervene respectfully. Yes, well, nowadays the star architects are fashionable and they intervene regardless of the place. They tend to just leave their imprint. And of course, this is completely contrary to what we believe in. Abelardo? Well, I think we live in an interesting time in history. That rejection continues to persist, especially among professors. It's true, but little by little, we are gaining ground. We do not have to fight against the establishment as used to be the case in the 60s. There are many areas in which we can reach agreements, and there are many points of contacts between tradition and modernity. There is not one single modernity. There are many variations. Karl Lagerfeld said that after the 80s, fashion no longer existed, but only dresses. He was referring to haute couture, of course, but I think something similar happens with architecture regarding modernism or metabolism or structuralism. Well, the fact that there's always an emphasis on the pedestrian, the scale of things, proximity, etc. I think architecture is increasingly closer to these tenets. And I think that's an important consideration to take into account in the field of traditional architecture. Well, I would like to know your experience, Alfonso and Ramon. Have you felt that rejection that Robert Adam has referred to, or you think it's not really that relevant? Well, I have been working for many years, maybe too many, and throughout my career, I have made some interventions in historic city centers and similar environments. So I would differ between renovation and intervention on historic city centers. I've done some of the latter with modern language, if you like. I have my doubts really about the very definition of traditional architecture. What is it? Maybe this refers only to a mere formalism, the external shell of a building. I think it's just great to use traditional construction where it is suited. In Mallorca, for instance, I've been able to build 100% stone buildings, stone walls. But and I think that was a nice experience, but I'm not too sure about what is traditional, what is not. I think we all have our own view of our work, and I don't like generalizations. But in principle, I would say I have not really felt that rejection. Alejandro de la Sota, my master, in the 50s, he intervened in Esquivel, and he went from there to build the Spanish embassy building in France, perfectly integrated with the architecture of Paris. He said that we need to protect heritage not because of economic considerations, but because of as an issue of sensitivity. Yes, I agree with you, Ramon. The truth is that a few years ago there was a certain rejection to these traditional architectural approaches, but you have very good examples of good traditional architecture, and you have very poor examples. Some of them, some interventions are excellent, others look like props. But I think large intervention projects are really those that receive the greatest amount of criticism, if you like. Okay, thanks everyone. We have another question. Manuel Jalón asks, do you think that the academic training of architects is enough to learn about constructive models, traditional techniques? Is that training that they receive enough to tackle projects? I think the three girls have shaken their heads quite vigorously. No, I don't think it is enough. A team of architects is not enough. First of all, we as architects, we do not have the training necessary to touch all bases, but a lot of graduates really are not prepared to take on these projects once they graduate. In the School of Madrid, we have a master's course on rehabilitation, which is very necessary, I think. And I think that the teachers in our school are not really moving in this direction, with some exceptions like Alejandro. Well, I also graduated from the School of Architecture of Madrid, and I only had one subject that was maintenance, and on the fourth year, and that's it. We architects are trained and educated towards new constructions, new projects. We practically learn nothing about traditional architecture. If you're interested, of course, you have a possibility of taking a master's course on traditional architecture. But then you have to complement that with some technical hands-on knowledge of traditional construction practices. And this applies even more not to architects, but to building technicians, assistant architects. Well, it's true that traditional architecture has to respond to the environment. You cannot just use one-size-fits-all recipes. You just cannot take something that is built in Japan and just do the same in Alcira. But of course, it's difficult for a School of Architecture to teach these kind of things. A school can teach and educate students on critical thinking, so that we understand that every city, every town is unique, and that you have to adapt to what is there, and what is a culture, what are the values, the traditions of the place. Well, training, the education we receive in schools is insufficient, but at the end of the day, it's just the beginning of a lifelong learning experience. Well, back in our days, we probably did not pay too much, did not have much interest or felt any appeal. Maybe we would just to focus on concrete, and we did not really take traditional construction much into consideration. Well, I think nowadays, as Abelardo has said, you cannot just stick to one form of architecture. It's just like music. There are thousands of music styles, but there's what we can call good music, and everybody knows good music when they listen to it. Okay. Thank you very much. I think we are reaching the end of our session. Maybe we can take one final question. Well, we only have 1 minute, so we will not have time for a final question. Thanks everyone for this very interesting discussion. It has been great to have several generations present in this panel discussion, because it's always very interesting to hear different experiences from professionals of different ages and who are also working, have worked at different historical time periods. And I think someone said, I think it's very interesting that it's all a matter of sensitivity. And I think it's important for local communities, for society at large, to be increasingly aware of the relevance of traditions, culture, roots, etc. So once again, thank you very much. Those of you who are listening from your homes, I invite you to visit the projects of the winning projects of the architecture competition. You can find it on our website. Thank you. Thank you, Alejandro. I would like to thank the audience also for their active participation and sending questions to the panel.